What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my full review of the Motorola Moto G Power 5G. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out the description where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, one of my favorite things about this phone is definitely the display. With this phone, we're getting a 6.5-inch 120Hz IPS LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 405, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So for what it is, I really have no complaints here. At 6.5 inches, sure, on one hand it's not nearly as large as something like a Moto G Stylus 5G for example, but at the same time, 6.5 inches is still a pretty decently large display. So if you're doing something like watching videos, reading, really any kind of content consumption, you will still get a pretty good experience. With the 1080p resolution, we're also getting a nice sharp, clear image. The colors also look pretty good, and in general, despite not being like AMOLED level, the display is still decently bright, and the viewing angles, while not being the best, are still at least okay. And then of course, with a 120Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is going to be a bit faster and smoother, making the phone feel a bit more premium to use. So in general, if you're looking for a mid-range phone that has a really nice display, you're definitely not going to go wrong with this phone. Now for storage, with the Moto G Power 5G, we're getting an entire 256GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so definitely a lot of storage here. For the average user, or really for pretty much anyone, you're most likely not going to have to worry about running out of space. Even at this point in 2023, 256GB is still a lot, even for higher end phones for that matter. So even if you're someone who's constantly downloading new apps and games and stuff like that, storage is most likely not going to be an issue here. But one thing I do want to point out is that with this phone, the one in this video at least is the factory unlocked version, and while as of the recording of this video, I haven't actually seen it being offered from a US carrier yet, I feel like it's really just a matter of time before carriers do start offering this phone, so just be aware. Obviously, I don't know now since it hasn't happened yet, but once the carriers start getting this phone, the storage may be different. But for the purpose of this video, again, this phone in my hand is factory unlocked, and it does have 256GB of internal storage. Now for security features, the Moto G Power 5G does have face unlock, and a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key. So pretty standard here, but I am glad to see we're getting both face unlock and a fingerprint scanner, because while this is definitely not uncommon, there are some phones that only have one or the other, and of course having options is always nice. But real quick, let's give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, real fast and responsive, no issues at all. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, with the Moto G Power 5G, up front, we got a real nice looking hole punch design for the selfie camera. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. So unfortunately there's no ultra wide camera here, but since I think 2021 or 2020 for that matter, there hasn't been a Moto G Power phone that has an ultra wide camera, so I'm not really that surprised. I was kind of hoping, since this is a higher end 5G phone, that they might kind of break the pattern of not having an ultra wide camera, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. But aside from this, I do think the camera setup here is at least decent. And then for video, this phone does have a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so no 4K, but really considering this phone is what, $299, $279 on sale, I'm really not surprised. But to give you an idea of what the camera can do, here's some pictures taken with the Moto G Power 5G. Overall, the photo quality is real good, and I really have no complaints. Sure, if you compare it to a much higher end device like a entry-level flagship phone like the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE or the Google Pixel 6a, obviously then the photo quality is not going to be nearly as good, but in general, for what it is, a really affordable kind of mid-range phone, I do think the quality is perfectly fine, and for the average user, you're probably not going to need a whole lot more than this. If you're doing stuff like taking photos for Instagram, for example, or sending photos to friends and family, or maybe taking vacation photos for your own memories, for that kind of use, I do think this phone will be perfectly fine. And really, if that's all you're doing, unless you're really into mobile photography or something like that, you definitely don't have to go spend $1,000 on a super high-end phone. You can easily just get something more affordable like this. And again, honestly, I feel like for most people, the photo quality here is perfectly fine. And then here's some pictures taken with the macro camera, and I do want to point out that specifically with this phone, the macro camera quality is actually really good. Now, I'm not personally a big macro camera user myself. I usually just take pictures with the regular camera, and honestly, in most cases, at this point in 2023, with really any decent smartphone camera, you can get a decently close-up detailed image without a macro camera anyway. And in my opinion, for most of these mid-range phones, it's usually even better that way. But with the Moto G Power 5G, I did notice the macro camera quality here is actually really good. So if using a macro camera is your thing, then you're definitely going to be happy here. But to give you an idea of what the video quality is like, take a look at this next sample. Here's a quick test video with the Moto G Power 5G. We are recording in 1080p right now. Also keep in mind what the audio sounds like. So as you can see, for what it is, the video quality is definitely decent too. So in general, if you're looking for an affordable phone under $300 and you want to make sure you have a good camera for daily use, I do think the Moto G Power 5G will be a great choice. Now for RAM and processor, with the Moto G Power 5G, in addition to obviously getting 5G connectivity, we are also getting pretty good performance here. With this phone, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 930 processor. So yeah, in general, for what it is, the performance is really good, which when compared to the previous Moto G Power phones, granted they're not 5G, but still, this is definitely quite an upgrade. I think the Moto G Power 2022 was actually a little bit slower than its predecessor, so going from a phone like that was honestly barely usable for typical daily activities like web browsing and social media to something like this that's not quite flagship level but approaching that kind of speed is definitely impressive. And when you consider this phone is going for, again, around $299 unlocked at full price, we're definitely getting some good value here. Now I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6 and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that of course is going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance wise compared to your current device, because depending on what you currently have, it may or may not actually be an upgrade. Now one thing I will say though is that while this phone is decently fast for what it is, definitely don't get this phone expecting anything near flagship level performance. If you're coming from maybe an older flagship phone like a Samsung Galaxy S10 for example, then this phone probably will feel like a performance downgrade, because while again it is decently fast for what it is, it's definitely not anywhere near as fast as a much higher end device. But again, for typical daily activities, if you're doing something like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, it works really well for that, and even a decent amount of mobile gaming. Overall, for those more basic, moderate daily activities, I have actually found the performance on this phone to be pretty good. Now for the battery, this phone has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 15-watt fast charging, so definitely a great battery here. With a 5000 mAh battery, of course, this is a really large battery, so with this phone you can expect to get great battery life and longevity. And when it comes to charging speed, first of all, I do want to point out, to actually use the 15-watt fast charging, you will need a 15-watt charger, which unfortunately this phone doesn't come with. Now to be fair, it at least does come with some sort of wall adapter, but as you can clearly see by this big 10 right here, this is only a 10-watt charger, so while it is decent, I mean, it's better than most wall adapters, and honestly a lot of phones like this don't even come with any kind of wall adapter. If you do care about using the full 15 watts, you will need an actual 15-watt charger, but in my experience with this phone, the charging speed is at least decent. Sure, when compared to some mid-range phones that have like 25-watt fast charging instead, it won't be quite as fast, but again, the charging speed here is pretty good, so most people won't have any issues. For the software, the Moto G Power 5G does have Android 13, so definitely great to see, and although I'm not really sure about the software support here, I know Motorola has been getting at least decently better over the past couple years. I feel like this phone will at least get Android 14 eventually, some point after it comes out, especially considering the Moto G Stylus 2022 that originally came with Android 11 just recently got the update to Android 12, so if that's anything to go off of, especially considering the Moto G Power 5G is in theory a bit higher end than that, this phone should at least be getting Android 14 if not 15 beyond that. But if software support in the long term is really that important to you, if you're planning on getting a phone and keeping it for like 3 or 4 years, I would personally get either like a Samsung or a Google phone. When it comes to software support, Samsung and Google tend to be the best. But if you're really just going to keep your phone for like a year or two, and maybe the software isn't really the most important thing to you, then in that case, this phone will be perfectly fine. When it comes to other features, unfortunately, this phone doesn't have NFC, which honestly is kind of a big disappointment, because considering at this point in 2023, in the US at least, pretty much every store you're going to go into has some sort of tap and pay. And of course, you do need NFC to use tap and pay. And while I know not everyone uses it, I feel like not having the option to use it at all is definitely a big drawback, especially considering compared to pretty much every other 5G phone I've seen recently, except for maybe like the lowest end T-Mobile Revel phone. But I want to say 99% of 5G phones in 2023 are going to have NFC. So seeing as this phone doesn't, whereas phones that are like $100 less do, I'm sure you can see the problem here. It just really doesn't make sense. And considering the Moto G Stylus 5G 2022 did have it, at first I kind of thought Motorola was was going in the right direction, but I guess I was kind of wrong there. So definitely keep in mind, if you do want to use tap and pay, you're not going to want to get this phone. But one thing this phone does have that I am happy to see is stereo audio. Now, in case you don't know what it is, when a phone has stereo audio, if you're doing something like watching a video or listening to music, sound is going to come out of both the main speaker and the earpiece, giving you a much more immersive experience. Now, this might not matter to everyone because some people use headphones all the time and some people might not even consume that much content anyway. So in that case, you might not even notice, but no matter what, I feel like it's nice to have at least a decent quality phone speaker because it does give you a lot more flexibility when you're consuming content. And in this price range, lots of phones don't have stereo audio. And I will say, if you're doing something like watching a video and you're only getting sound from the main speaker, it doesn't sound nearly as good. So if you are someone who generally consumes a lot of content, definitely keep this in mind. Now, taking a look at the overall design, I do think this phone is pretty nice. The bezels are maybe not the thinnest, but they are decently thin, and together with the nice hole punch design for the selfie camera, the phone does have a nice modern look. That being said, despite looking good, I kind of have mixed feelings about the materials. On one hand, the back has this nice, kind of blanking on the word, frosted kind of matte finish, so you really can't see fingerprints at all, which is definitely nice. And the build quality is also pretty good. But on the other hand, honestly, the plastic feels kind of cheap. The phone really doesn't have a ton of weight to it, and honestly, when it comes to stuff like durability, I feel like the material here overall is gonna scratch pretty easily. So with this phone, I definitely do recommend getting a case, especially if you're like maybe working outside a lot, for example, and the phone is really gonna be exposed to the elements, because while again, the phone has decent build quality and it does look pretty nice, the durability is definitely not always the best. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the Motorola Moto G Power 5G. Overall, despite not being the perfect device, it's missing features like NFC and an ultra-wide camera, and again, the materials are a little questionable. But despite all this, I do think this is actually a pretty good phone, and honestly, there is a lot to like about it. We are again getting a really nice display here, so if you're watching a lot of videos, going on social media, playing games, stuff like that, things are gonna look really nice here. We're also getting a ton of storage. The camera setup, even though it doesn't have an ultra-wide camera, does at least have good photo quality. The phone also has a large battery, Android 13, and really good performance with 5G connectivity. So in general, if you're looking for a more affordable 5G phone for more basic activities, then I do think this phone is definitely worth considering. But this concludes my review of the Motorola Moto G Power 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.